Building a synchronous query infrastructure for a React application in order to adapt its components for external data fetching. So asynchronous query infrastructure, what do I mean by that? In the previous video of the React App Structuring video series, we have been displayed some data to our React Todo application about to-dos. But this is still a data fixture that we are importing into our component directly. Instead, we will eventually want to fetch this data from a remote server. For this, the first thing we need to do is to prepare our components for such remote data fetching. And this is where asynchronous queries appear in our React application structure. The application we are going to work with is, as always, available in the public repository. The link to the starter and the finished code of this particular tutorial is in the video description. When you will check them out, don't forget to put a start to the repository. So now let's define our first query. All queries of a module live in a conventional directory called just queries. The query by itself is a React hook, so its name will start from the use prefix and the query name itself. Here we are going to define the query function itself, of course with the default export, and apply the naming convention to its function name. Now, what does the query return? It is an object with the following properties: loading to indicate if the query has been completed or not, error if it occurs, and the actual data if the query is completed successfully. By the way, this response is inspired by the Apollo GraphQL API for React. So now it would make sense to define a common interface for this response. In our common module, we don't have the interfaces directory yet, so we can now create it. And to define the interface, not so much for the query, but for its result. Now export default, of course, interface. So the first property, as we remember, is loading, which is Boolean. Then there is an error, which will be the error and which might be absent. And then the data, which might also be absent. The type of the data depends on the query itself. So we will define it with the generic type. And in order for not to be too restrictive, we will allow this type to be any by default. So now let's apply this response to our actual query. For our particular example, we will not work with errors yet. We will define loading to be false by default. Also, we know already that we will expect this result to return the array of to-do items. And here we can once again reuse our to-do items fixture, but to see some difference from what we have now, let's just apply its part. Okay, so now it is time to apply this query to our component. We can reassign the name of this variable right here, which means that we are not going to need this anymore. And since our data may be undefined, we will just add a condition here. So now what do we have in our application? As we can see, we are now just rendering the part of our fixture. I think we can remove these limitations, so because everything is working fine now. Yeah, and that's it about how to define the queries in the React application. So we are ready to commit all this. Of course, in this query we barely render the items fixture. We don't work with anything like loading or error yet. But in the future videos I will show you how to simulate the server responses using queries, how to fetch actual remote data with queries, and many other useful things. So make sure you are subscribed to this channel in order for not to miss them out. Also, if you like this tutorial, hit that thumbs up button and leave your comment down below. My name is Anton. Don't stop coding, don't stop growing.